No battle has caused more controversy, produced so large a literature in so short a time, or given rise to more popular interest and legend than that of the Marne. But then this crisis of September 1914 wrought the downfall of the German war plan and thereby changed the course of history. For if it be true, as it certainly is in part, that Germany lost the war when she lost this battle, it is natural that claimants to the distinction of having won it should be many. The first legend to arise was that Foch had won it by driving the German center into the marshes of St. Gond, and even today, in total disregard of the facts and times of the battle, this is still given currency by reputable historians outside France. But while, like a pebble dropped in water, the ripples of this story were still spreading, knowledgeable opinion in France was violently arguing whether the credit was due to Joffre, the commander-in-chief, or Gallieni, his quondam superior and then subordinate, who had delivered from Paris the blow at the German flank, exposed by Kluck's wheel inwards before Paris. One school contended that Joffre had conceived the idea of the counter-offensive and at most admitted under pressure of facts that Gallieni's initiative in seeing the opportunity had given an impulse to Joffre's decision to seize it. The other school argued that Joffre, after the failure of his first attempt to stage a counter-offensive on the line of the Somme, had given up all idea of a fresh attempt at an early date and that but for Gallieni's fiery determination and persuasion, the retreat would have continued. A dispassionate judgment is now possible, and if we recognize that on Joffre fell the grave responsibility of taking the decision, the weight of evidence shows that Gallieni's inspiration dictated both the sight and promptness of the thrust. Furthermore, it rebuts the alternative case of Joffre's advocates that Gallieni marred the prospect by precipitating the blow, for we know that 24 hours delay would have enabled the Germans to complete the protective redistribution which Gallieni interrupted. On the German side, a similar controversy has raged as to whether the order to retreat was a mistake and whether Kluck of the First Army, Bülow of the Second, or the envoy of the Supreme Command, Colonel Hensch, was responsible for the fatal decision. The multiple controversy has at least served to show that the Marne was a psychological rather than a physical victory. So, also, have been most of the immortal victories of history, with the actual fighting a secondary influence. For the profoundest truth of war is that the issue of battles is usually decided in the minds of the opposing commanders, not in the bodies of their men. The best history would be a register of their thoughts and emotions, with a mere background of events to throw them into relief. But the delusion to the contrary has been fostered by the typical military history, filled with details of the fighting and assessing the cause of a victory by statistical computations of the number engaged. The Marne was so clearly a psychological issue that the minds of the commanders have received due analysis. But even so, the combat complex has tended to narrow the analysis of minds to the area where the clash of bodies took place. Thereby certain suggestive evidence has escaped comment. This evidence may be expressed in a startling question. Was the victory primarily due to the heated imagination of an English railway porter and to a party of temporary visitors to Ostend? Or, at the least, did these humble worthies constitute with Gallieni the mainspring of victory? The suggestion is not so fantastic as it seems when we study the mental atmosphere of the German commanders. Before and during the crisis they were constantly looking backward apprehensively over their right shoulders, fearful of an Allied stroke against their ever-lengthening communications in Belgium and northern France. Unfortunately for the Allies, there was small warrant for this nervousness. The belated plea for landing the Belgian Franks on the Belgian coast had been overruled by the Wilsonian pledge and policy of tying it as an appendix to the French left wing. Yet the Belgian field army, if under German guard at Antwerp, had at least caused a serious detachment of German strength to this guard and more, was a chronic irritation to German nerves. The fertile brain of Mr. Churchill was also at work. Resources were scanty, but he dispatched a brigade of Marines under Brig General Aston to Ostend, with orders to give their presence the fullest publicity. They landed on August 27 and stayed ashore until the 31st. Now to turn to the other side of the hill. On September 5, the day when the French troops were moving forward to strike at Kluck, Colonel Hensch, the representative of the Supreme Command, came to the threatened army with this ominous and despairing warning: the news is bad. The 6th and 7th armies are blocked. The 4th and 5th are meeting with strong resistance. The English are disembarking fresh troops continuously on the Belgian coast. There are reports of a Russian expeditionary force in the same parts. A withdrawal is becoming inevitable. We know from other sources that the 3,000 Marines had grown in the German command's imagination to 40,000 and that the Russians were said to be 80,000. Thus the German flank army was left to face its ordeal with the belief that its rear was seriously menaced and that in any case the Supreme Command was contemplating a withdrawal. At the least such knowledge must have been insidiously enervating during a period of strain. If the Supreme Command came to have doubts of the Belgian news, it also became imbued with the idea of a retirement, and when Hensch came again on September 9 with full powers to coordinate it, should rearward movements have begun, not only had these begun, but they also coincided with fresh disturbing news from Belgium. For if the Belgian sortie from Antwerp that day was short-lived, it had all the incalculable psychological effect of menacing news at a moment of crisis. The German retreat gathered momentum and spread. With it turned the tide of the war. History should do justice to Mr. Churchill's happy inspiration and General Aston's handful of marine promenaders. But equally helpful was that amazing Russian myth which originated and spread so mysteriously. Mr. Churchill, we know, had actually proposed to bring a Russian expeditionary force in such a way. Did the proposal perhaps leak out and become exaggerated into realization in the process? General opinion, however, has long ascribed the legend to the heated imagination of a railway porter, working on the simple fact of the night passage of troop trains with Gaelic-speaking occupants. If so, a statue in Whitehall to the unknown porter is overdue. Keeping this external factor on the circumference of our thought, let us turn to trace the sequence of events in the actual battle zone. The immediate chain of causation begins with the escape by retreat of the French and British armies from the frontier trap into which Joffre's plan had led them. The first, highly colored, reports from the army commands in the battles of the frontiers had given the German Supreme Command the impression of a decisive victory. It was under this hallucination that Moltke, on August 25, cheerfully and needlessly dispatched 4 divisions to the Russian front to the detriment of his right-wing punch, already weakened by 7 divisions left for the investment of derelict fortresses, truly a bad investment. Then the comparatively small totals of prisoners raised doubts in Moltke's mind and led him to a more sober estimate of the situation. The Kaiser's easy optimism now irritated him. He has already a shout Haramut that I hate like death. The new pessimism of Moltke combined with the renewed optimism of his army commanders to produce a fresh change of plan, which contained the seeds of disaster. While Kluck's army, on the German extreme right or outer flank, was pressing on the heels of the British so close that the outside British corps, Smith-Dorrien, was forced to halt and give battle, Kluck's neighbor on the inside, Bülow, was following up Landrazac's French Fifth Army. When on August 26 the British left wing fell back southwards badly mauled from Le Cateau, Kluck had turned back southwestwards again. If this direction was partly due to misconception of the line of retreat taken by the British, the idea that they were retreating to the Channel ports, it was also in accordance with his original role of a wide circling sweep. And by carrying him into the Amiens-Peronne area, where the first parts of the newly formed French Sixth Army were just detraining after their switch from Alsace, it had the effect of dislocating Joffre's design for an early return to the offensive by compelling the Sixth Army to fall back hurriedly towards the shelter of the Paris defenses. But Kluck had hardly swung out to the southwest before he was induced to swing in again. For in order to ease the pressure on the British, Joffre had ordered Landrazac to halt and strike back against the pursuing Germans, and Bülow, shaken by the threat, called on Kluck for aid. Landrazac's attack on August 29 was stopped before Bülow needed this help, but he asked Kluck to wheel in nevertheless, in order to cut off Landrazac's retreat. Before acceding, Kluck referred to Moltke. The request came at a moment when Moltke was becoming perturbed in general over the way the French were slipping away from his embrace and, in particular, over a gap which had opened between his 2nd, Bülow, and 3rd, Hausen, armies, through the latter having already turned south from southwest to help the 4th Army, its neighbor on the other flank. Hence Moltke approved Kluck's change of direction, which meant the inevitable abandonment of the original wide sweep round the far side of Paris. Now the flank of the wheeling German line would pass the near side of Paris and across the face of the Paris defenses. By this contraction of his frontage for the sake of security, Moltke sacrificed the wider prospects inherent in the wide circling sweep of the original plan. And, as it proved, instead of contracting the risk, he exposed himself to a fatal counterstroke. On the night of September 2, Moltke sent a message to the right-wing commanders, which confirmed the change of plan and foreshadowed a new one. The French are to be forced away from Paris in a southeasterly direction. The First Army will follow in echelon behind the Second Army and will be responsible henceforward for the flank protection of the force. But the First Army was a full day's march ahead of the Second. If Kluck tried to carry out the second part of the message, he would be neglecting the first part. Hence he decided to march on, while detailing an incomplete reserve corps and a depleted cavalry division to serve as a flank guard. How lightly he regarded any danger from Paris is also shown in the facts that no aircraft were allotted to the flank guard and no air reconnaissance ordered to the westward. Meantime Moltke was growing depressed and his decision to abandon the original plan was definitely taken on September 4. In place of it, Moltke substituted a narrower envelopment of the French center and right. His own center, 4th and 5th Armies, was to press southeast, while his left, 6th and 7th Armies, striking southwestwards, sought to break through the fortified barrier between Toul and Epinal, the Jaws, thus closing inwards on either side of Verdun. Meantime his right, 1st and 2nd Armies, was to turn outwards and, facing west, hold off any counter-move which the French might attempt from the neighborhood of Paris. Moltke's order continued to ignore that Kluck was ahead of Bülow in the race southward and had already crossed the Marne. For it not only told Kluck to remain facing the east side of Paris, i.e. facing west, but to remain north of the Marne, while Bülow wheeled into line, facing west, between the Marne and the Seine. Thus to fulfill the order Kluck had not merely to halt while Bülow caught up and passed him, but to perform a sort of backward somersault. Such gymnastics are somewhat upsetting to the equilibrium of a large army. And in this case the French countermove which Moltke wished to guard against had already begun before his new plan could take effect. Moreover Kluck, reluctant to be thus deprived of the chance of being the agent of decisive victory, continued his advance south towards the Seine on the 5th, saying that the movement to face west might be made at leisure. For the moment he still left a weak detachment of 3 brigades and a few cavalry to guard his flank. Next morning it was struck by the French 6th Army moving out from Paris. During these days the Franco-British retreat had continued. On August 30, Joffre yielding to the pressure of a government alarmed at seeing him abandon the capital by his direction of retreat detached Monaury's 6th Army to reinforce the Paris garrison. Parting with it signified his abandonment of the flank counterstroke, for this was the force he had assembled for its execution. Moreover, a memorandum drawn up that same day shows that he had transferred his faith to a counter-offensive against the German center in the hope of accomplishing the rupture which we formerly attempted facing northeast and debouching from the Meuse. On September 1, Joffre issued orders for the retreat of the Allied armies to be continued to a line south of the Seine, Aube, and Ornain rivers. Not only was the effect to take the armies away from and far to the southeast of Paris, but a commander who is contemplating an early counter-offensive does not place the obstacle of a river barrier between himself and the enemy. And a further note to the several army commanders next day added that it was Joffre's intention to organize and fortify this line, whence he planned to deliver not an immediate but an eventual counter-offensive. That same day he replied to a suggestion of a stand on the Marne made by Sir John French and communicated through the Minister of War. I do not believe it possible to envisage a general action on the Marne with the whole of our forces. But I consider that the cooperation of the English army in the defense of Paris is the only course that can give an advantageous result. To the Minister of War and to Gallieni he repeated the same verdict. When zealous apologists say that the idea of a counter-offensive was at the back of Joffre's mind, the historian can agree. This array of evidence is more than sufficient to dispel the legend that Joffre had any intention of giving battle on the Marne or that he planned the counterstroke which tilted the balance so dramatically. The definite nature of his reply was the more significant because, on September 1, a staff officer with Landrezac's army had found the German order for a change of direction in the wallet of a dead officer, and this was sent to Joffre's headquarters early next day. And on the morning of the 3rd, the change direction, to the southeast, of Kluck's marching columns, had been noticed and reported by British aviators. In the afternoon they added that these columns were crossing the Marne, and in the evening Monaury reported that there were no German troops left in the area west of the line Paris-Senlis. All this was reported to Joffre without making any impression on his plan save that on the night of the 2nd, he altered the limit of his retirement to a line still farther south. But from Gallieni, the new military governor of Paris, even a fragment of information gained on the 3rd had drawn an instant response. He ordered Monaury to carry out further air and cavalry reconnaissances as soon as it was light on the 4th. Quickly convinced by these early reports that the Germans were moving obliquely past the front of the Paris defenses, exposing their own flank, Gallieni was equally quick to act. At 9 a.m. he ordered Monaury's army to get ready for a move eastward to strike the Germans in flank. He then informed Joffre by telephone of his preparatory moves and urged him to sanction a counter-offensive. This consent was necessary not only to ensure a combined effort but because Joffre had persuaded the new Minister of War to subordinate Gallieni to himself. Gallieni's fiery and inspired arguments made an impression, but no more, on the slow-thinking commander-in-chief of the field armies. To save time while Joffre was still cogitating, Gallieni rushed off by motor to Melun to explain the new situation to the British and if possible gain their cooperation. Unfortunately, Sir John French was absent from his headquarters and at first Gallieni could not even find Archibald Murray, his chief of the general staff. It was a curious scene. Gallieni, for his part, found the British staff unsettled and depressed, not hesitating to say that if England had known the condition of the French army, she would not have entered the war. They were hardly in the mood to discern the underlying qualities of this most unmilitary-looking military genius, bespectacled and untidy, with shaggy mustache, black buttoned boots and yellow leggings. Little wonder perhaps that one eminent soldier with a pungent gift of humor remarked that no British officer would be seen speaking to such a comedian. Gallieni pointed out to Murray that it was vital to seize the opportunity which the Germans had given by offering their right flank, told him that the army of Paris was already in motion against the German flank, and begged that the British should cease to retreat and join with his forces in an offensive next day. Murray, however, showed une grande repugnance entre dans nos voeux and declared that he could do nothing in the absence of his commander. After waiting 3 hours in vain for Sir John French's return, Gallieni had to leave at 5 p.m. with a mere promise of a telephone message later. This brought no satisfaction, for its purport was that the British would continue their retreat next day. Their decision had been confirmed by receiving a letter, written that morning, from Joffre who said, "My intention, in the present situation, is to pursue the execution of the plan that I have had the honor to communicate to you, that of retiring behind the Seine, and only to engage on the selected line with all forces united." The meager influence which the news of Kluck's change of direction had achieved was shown by a subsequent paragraph which said, "In the case of the German armies continuing their movement towards the SSE, perhaps you will agree that your action can be most effectively applied on the right bank of the river, between the Marne and Seine." This casual qualification to the definite opening statement gave the British little encouragement to fall in with Gallieni's audacious suggestion. There is a dramatic contrast between the sluggish working of Joffre's mind, gradually but all too slowly veer. After Gallieni's morning message, Joffre had been moved so far as to send a telegram, timed 12:45 p.m., to French at Despery, who had superseded Landrezac in command of the Fifth Army, saying, "Please inform me if you consider that your army is in a state to make it an attack with any chance of success." An inquiry which hardly suggests a sense of vital opportunity or an urge to action. This reached French at Despery, while Henry Wilson, of French's staff, was with him, and, after discussion, a reply was drafted, saying the battle cannot take place before the day after tomorrow, and that the Fifth Army would continue its retreat on the morrow, attacking on the 6th. To this message he added, in his own hand, a qualifying note even less encouraging. "In order that the operation may be successful, the necessary conditions are: 1. The close and absolute cooperation of the 6th Army debouching on the left bank of the Irk on the morning of the 6th. It must reach the Irk tomorrow or the British won't budge. 2. My army can fight on the 6th, but its situation is not brilliant. No reliance can be placed on the reserve divisions." What was likely to be the effect on a Joffre of such a discouraging reply to his tentative inquiry? To harden his hesitation. That hesitation was the more natural because Berthelot, his chief advisor, was vehemently in favor of continuing the retreat and maintaining the original plan. Then early in the afternoon came an ominous report of German progress across the Marne. As Joffre's own memoirs relate, this was all that was needed to cause Berthelot to return to the charge. The memoirs, it is true, argue that Joffre merely continued to put off a decision, but they admit that he issued new instructions that were designed to accord with Berthelot's plan. Still more significantly, the decision was taken to move the headquarters over 30 miles farther south. Then, while Joffre was having an early dinner, French at Despery's message arrived. The next link in the chain of causation fits in with a click, the click of a telephone switch putting a call through. For if Gallieni's coup d'etat gained the opportunity, it was, as he himself said, coup de téléphone which gained the Battle of the Marne. On returning to his headquarters in Paris, he had found a belated message from Joffre, which was favorable to his proposal for a counterstroke, but preferred it to be delivered south of the Marne, where it would have lost the greater effect given by a blow against the enemy's flanks and rear. Gallieni seized the telephone, got through to Joffre, and by the fervor and force of his arguments at last won his sanction for the army of Paris to strike north of the Marne, as part of a general counteroffensive by the left-wing armies. Joffre promised to obtain the cooperation of the British. Gallieni promptly issued orders, 8:30 p.m., to Monaury's army, which he reinforced. After several hours' delay, Joffre's orders were sent out for the offensive on September 6. It was too late now for the 5th and too late to be generally effective even for the 6th. The delay had far-reaching consequences, not all ill. On the 5th, while Monaury's troops were moving east towards the enemy, both the British and French Desperés were marching south in accord with their original orders, away from the enemy and even away from each other. But for Gallieni, the gap they thus opened might have proved perilous. When they turned about next day, they had much ground to recover and were not as quick in retracing their steps as the situation demanded. This disappearance of the British not only enabled but encouraged Kluck, who had been taken completely unawares, to pull back half his main body, 2 and 4th Corps, from the sector where the British had been, to reinforce the hard-pressed flank guard, which was trying to hold off Monaury's menacing advance against the German rear. The arrival of these fresh forces began to check Monaury's advance on the 7th, and Gallieni pushed forward every possible reserve he could scrape up in order to strengthen Monaury. He recurred the famous if legend-crusted episode of the Paris taxicabs. A fresh division had just detrained near Paris, but it was 40 miles from the battlefront. If it marched thither it would be too late, and there was only sufficient rail transport to take half the division. That afternoon, the police held up taxicabs in the streets, bundling the passengers out in some cases, and, after collecting 600 cabs, sent them to the suburb of Gagny, where they filled up with soldiers. Gallieni came to see the performance and, with mingled gratification and amusement, exclaimed, "Well, at least it's not commonplace." During the night, this forerunner of the future motorized column swept, as only Paris taxicabs can sweep, through the outlying villages and past their amazed inhabitants, making 2 journeys, with 3,000 soldiers at a time. Unfortunately, these taxicabs maintained their traditional preference for speed over reliability and, passing and repassing, became so mixed that on the morning of the 8th, several hours were spent in sorting out their passengers before the division could attack. The pressure on the Germans gained extra force from the fact that it was directed against their rear flank. If Gallieni had received the 2 further army corps for which he had asked days before and which were only just arriving piecemeal, the German forces south of the Marne might have been cut off and the battle been as decisive tactically as it was strategically. Even in the actual situation, the menace was such that at 10 p.m. on the 6th, Kluck called back his 2 remaining army corps, so creating a 30-mile wide gap between himself and the neighboring army of Bülow. Only 2 weak cavalry corps, with a few Jaeger battalions, were left to fill it, and Kluck failed to arrange that this thin screen should be put under a single command. The consequences were fatal. Although he was able to hold and even press back Monaury's troops, the gap he had left in the southern front uncovered Bülow's flank. Although still untouched by French Desperé's low advance on the 7th, Bülow, sensitive to his raw side, drew back his right to the north bank of the Petite Marne. And when news came that the British were advancing into the center of the gap, it proved the signal for the German retreat, which began on September 9. If the continuance of the British withdrawal on September 5 had marred the chance of a crushing victory, it was a pleasant irony of fate that their very withdrawal made possible the victory as actually achieved. It is necessary, however, to take account of the situation on other parts of the battlefront, for, unless the German intentions elsewhere had been frustrated, Joffre's victory would have been impossible and defeat probable. To the frustration of their left-wing attack in the east, or Lorraine sector, the Germans themselves were the chief contributors. For by pressing the French back on their own fortress line, they had already made their task of breaking through it almost impossible. And yet another of the many accidents of the Marne made their repulse certain. For when Dubail's and de Castelnau's armies, after their defeat in the Battle of Morhinge-Saarburg, ended their hasty retreat, their lines sagged inwards. And into this re-entrant, formed quite unintentionally, the main German attack was launched, pushing towards that very gap of charms which the French in earlier years had prepared for their reception. Thus the French were given an opportunity to strike back effectively at the German flanks, and thereby they temporarily paralyzed the original German advance, which came to a halt on August 27. This not only gave the French breathing space to strengthen their position, but enabled Joffre, with safety, to transfer part of the force from the right wing to the more critical left wing. News of this transfer inspired Moltke to frame his new plan of September 5 and lured him into another vain attack on the French fortified barrier, despite protest from the Crown Prince Rupprecht of Bavaria, commanding the 6th Army. The new attack was launched frontally against the Grand Couronne de Nancy, the ridge which formed a flank buttress for the Gap of Charms. And the Kaiser arrived with his white cuirassiers, like an actor waiting his call, to make a triumphal entry into Nancy. But successive assaults, inadequately prepared, collapsed under the well-knit and superior fire of the French artillery, and on September 8 Moltke ordered Rupprecht to stop the offensive and the vain loss of life. Ruprecht had been urged into it against his own judgment by the excessive confidence of the artillery expert Major Bauer that his super-heavy howitzers would have the same effect as on the obsolete Belgian fortresses. Yet, curiously, he now only gave up the attack under protest, so Mickeberich was the judgment of the military leaders of 1914-18. The German Center, 5th and 4th Armies, west of Verdun, was no better able to fulfill its role as the right arm of the pincer-like squeeze ordained in Moltke's modified plan. In the Verdun area, Sarrail had replaced Ruffy as commander of the French Third Army, and the first instructions he received indicated not only a continued retreat but the abandonment of Verdun. Sarrail thought differently, however, and determined to cling on to the Verdun pivot as long as possible without losing touch with the Fourth Army to the west. It was a happy piece of initiative, and the break thus placed on the southeastward advance of the enemy's Fifth Army, under the German Crown Prince, was an essential factor in upsetting Moltke's plan. The stout resistance of Sarrail's troops, and still more the deadly fire of their artillery, not only held up but paralyzed the Crown Prince's advance. And a belated attempt on the 9th to break the deadlock by a night attack ended in a suicidal fiasco, with the Germans firing on each other. Sarrail, however, asked in vain for reinforcements, which might have enabled him to convert his resistance into a dangerous counterstroke from Verdun westwards against the German flank, for by holding on to Verdun, he had formed one side of a sack, into which the German armies between him and Monaury, on the other side, had pushed. The German Third Army, Hausen, formed a link between the German center and right wing, and was assigned the indefinite role of being ready to support either. This role was perhaps in part the reflection of the fact that, being composed of Saxons, the Prussians tended to discount its value. In the event it was virtually divided. Its left was used to help the Fourth Army in the abortive attack on the French Fourth Army, de Langle-de-Carry. An attack which, after perhaps the severest fighting of the whole battle, was driven to ground by the French artillery. Its right joined with Bülow's left in an attack on Foch, who had taken over command of a new 9th Army in the French center, formed by simple subtraction from de Langle-de-Carry's army. Among all the legends of the Marne, that which has grown up around Foch's part is the most comprehensive and has the least substance. The first claim, still widely believed, is that Foch decided the issue of the whole battle by a counterstroke which threw the Prussian guard into the marshes of St. Gond. In fact, however, the Germans took their leave without interference after the issue had been decided farther west. The second, and more modest claim, is that Foch made the victory possible by preventing a German breakthrough in the French center. Even this is inaccurate because the Germans were not trying to break through here. Bülow was merely carrying out his new protective task of wheeling his line to face west. And, in the course of this wheel, his left wing naturally bumped against Foch's front. A further paradox is that although Foch issued repeated orders for attacks, his troops in reality were on the defensive, a defense needlessly desperate owing to his own disobedience of orders. At 1:30 a.m. on September 6, Foch had received Joffre's famous order for the general about turn. Unlike the other armies, he received it in time to act on his share of it, which was to cover the flank of Franchet Despery's attack by holding the southern exits of the marshes of St. Gond. Instead, he concentrated the bulk of his forces for an offensive north of the marshes, leaving the weak 11th Corps to hold the wide and vulnerable sector east of the marshes. His troops were tired and much reduced by the hard retreat, and their offensive quickly died away. In their reflux they failed to hold firmly the southern exits of the marshes. Thus Foch continued to keep his main strength on that flank. But the Germans could only cross by the narrow causeways and in consequence made a side step as they might have done earlier. On the 7th, their attack east of the marshes broke down under the fire of the French artillery. As the only way of evading it, a bayonet attack in the half-light before dawn was arranged. This caught Foch's right by surprise, and it gave way rapidly. Fortunately, the Germans did not follow up as rapidly and so captured few of the tormenting guns. Even so, the situation was serious, and Foch called for help. Franchet Despery lent a corps to support his left, and Joffre sent another to fill the gap now yawning on his right. On the 9th, the continued German attack against Foch's right made fresh progress and met little resistance until, shortly before 2 p.m., it was stopped by receiving Bülow's now notorious order for a general retirement. The Germans drew off undisturbed and even unobserved. To meet the earlier emergency, Foch had taken the 42nd Division from his intact left wing and switched it across to his right. But it only arrived in time to fire its guns in the twilight after the vanished foe, contrary to the popular legend of its decisive counterstroke against the flank of the German breakthrough. And one has to add that although Bülow had exposed his flank in making the wheel, Foch thought only of making a frontal counterattack. On the battle as a whole, his main, and most serious, effect was that he detracted from the main offensive instead of helping to cover it. In our survey of the battlefront, we have now traveled back to the decisive western flank. Let us focus our eyes on the various headquarters behind the German front and examine the wavering gusts of opinion which culminated in the German retirement. The Supreme Command was back at Luxembourg, whither it had moved from Koblenz on August 30th and depended for communication with the armies on wireless, supplemented by occasional visits by staff officers in motor cars. No regular motor or motorcycle dispatch service had been organized, and wireless communication suffered not only from the time lost in enciphering and deciphering, but from interference from the Eiffel Tower in Paris. As the army commanders, faithful to the tradition of 1870, were jealous of control, information was as sparse as it was slow, except when they had successes to report and exaggerate. Throughout the crisis of the battle, from September 7-9, no single report of any value came back from the front, and, as late as the 12th, Moltke had no knowledge of what had happened to Kluck's army, or where it was. Perhaps this ignorance made little difference, for on September 8, Falkenhayn, then at Luxembourg in his capacity of Minister of War, noted in his diary. Only one thing is certain. Our general staff has completely lost its head. Schlieffen's notes do not help any further, and so Moltke's wits come to an end. Moreover, Moltke had already reconciled himself to defeat. For the gloom at Luxembourg is well shown by the fact that when, on September 8, Lieutenant Colonel Hensch left, as his emissary, to visit in turn the 5 armies west of Verdun, he was given full powers to coordinate the retreat, should rearward movements have been initiated. He found none had occurred, if he found little confidence, at the headquarters of the 5th, 4th, and 3rd armies. Passing on, he spent the night of the 8th with Bülow, and there found such an intensification of gloom that when he left in the morning, he could at least feel confidence on one point, that orders for a retreat would soon be given. And about 9 a.m. on the 9th, air reports told Bülow that 6 enemy columns, 5 British and 1 of French cavalry, were approaching the Marne and so entering the mouth of the gap. By 11 a.m. he had issued orders for the retreat of his army to begin at 1 p.m., sending word to Kluck of his action. Hensch, delayed by blocks and panics on the road, did not reach Kluck's headquarters till almost noon. There, according to his evidence, he found that orders for a retirement had already gone out and in confirming them merely added the direction of the retreat northeastward. But Kluck's chief of staff, Kull, asserts that these orders were only the mistake of a subordinate and that he had merely ordered a swing back of his left in view of the fact that the British were almost behind it. He further says that Hensch, in view of Bülow's situation, gave him orders to retreat. And Hensch is not alive to contradict him. But the facts that the withdrawal began at 2 p.m., that the roads behind had been cleared, and that neither Kull nor Kluck troubled to ask for a written order, go far to support Hensch by showing their eagerness to be off. Kull, indeed, has admitted that the imminent breakthrough of the British and French at Despery made the retreat inevitable. And, owing to the British penetration, Kluck's army had to retreat northward, thus leaving the gap still open. The most curious of all the many accidents of the Marne is its accidental reproduction of the perfect pattern Napoleonic battle, the pattern which Napoleon several times fulfilled and which General Kamen and other students believe was normally in his mind. Its characteristics were that while the enemy was gripped in front, a maneuver was directed against one of his flanks, a maneuver which was intended not to be decisive in itself, but to create the opportunity for a decisive stroke. For the threat of envelopment caused a stretching of the enemy's line to ward it off, and so created a weak joint on which the decisive stroke then fell. On the Marne, Gallieni caused this stretching, and the British pierced the joint. The pattern was executed perfectly, yet quite unconsciously. Hence we see clearly that the continued retreat of the British on the 5th and their slow advance on the 6th and 7th were strategically invaluable, holding back unintentionally as Napoleon would have done purposely. If their decisive thrust had been disclosed earlier, the joint would hardly have been weakened by the removal of Kluck's last 2 corps, the departure of which, even as it was, Bülow delayed until early on the 8th. And the fact that Montgomery's stroke was definitely checked while these 2 corps were still on the march towards him is sufficient evidence that his stroke in itself could not have caused a decision. But the continued slowness of the advance on the 8th, 9th, and 10th was the negation of the Napoleonic pattern. And it proved fatal to the chance of converting the German retreat into a disaster. Thereby it paved the way for the 4 long years of trench warfare. In part, it was due to the obstacle provided by successive rivers. But in still greater part, it was due to want of impulsion and misguided direction. Sir John French seems to have had little faith in the prospect and still less in his allies' efforts. In consequence, he trod on the brake rather than the accelerator, besides keeping most of his cavalry on his right flank and even in rear of it as a link with his French neighbor instead of a spearhead of the pursuit. Indeed, not until the 11th was the cavalry really launched in pursuit. French at Despery's advance was even more cautious. His right was tied back to Foch. His center slowly followed up but did not catch up Bülow's retiring wing. His left neglected to push along a completely open path. A further cause of delay, however, was the tactical method employed in the advance. The old idea of keeping an even alignment still ruled, as it did until 1918, so that if one corps or division was checked its neighbors tended to halt. Thus frequent opportunities were missed for pushing on past the flanks of a temporary resistance and maintaining the momentum of the advance. And because the British and French missed this opportunity, it was to be left for 1918 to see and the Germans to apply the method of nature, for thus does any current or stream take the line of least resistance, finding a way past an obstacle and then flowing on, while the back eddies wash away the now isolated obstacle. Perchance also the victory might have been more decisive to the shortening of the war if its creator had not been removed from control at the beginning of it. Having already limited the power of Gallieni's blow, Joffre seized the first chance to deprive him of his powers of directing it. Would that he had been as quick in exploiting the weakness of the rival army. For on September 11 Joffre informed Gallieni that he would resume direct control of Monaury's army, leaving Gallieni to fret his soul within the confines of Paris while watching the fruits of victory slipping from the grasp of his slow-thinking superior. Throughout the battle, Gallieni's governing idea had been to direct all reserves to the north towards the enemy's rear, although several times frustrated by Joffre. With Gallieni's disappearance, the advance became purely frontal, giving the Germans the breathing space to reorganize and stand firm on the line of the Aisne. Not until then, September 17, did Joffre's mind awake to the idea of concentrating by rail, a fresh massive maneuver behind the German flank. As a result, in the so-called race to the sea, the French were always an army corps too few and 24 hours too late until the trench front stretched to the sea. But this was not the sole failure to take advantage of the temporary state of disorder and indecision behind the German line. It is the sober verdict of General Edmonds, the British official historian, that had some of the 14 British Territorial Force divisions and 14 mounted brigades, with the 6th Division still in England, been landed at the Channel coast ports to fall on the German communications and rear, a decisive tactical result might have been obtained and the war finished. Even as it was, on reaching the Aisne, an opportunity had remained only to be missed. Indeed, the official history states that the prospects of a breakthrough never were brighter than on the morning of the 13th. Thanks to German carelessness and the initiative of various junior commanders, the passage of the river had been achieved on both flanks. And from all the information furnished to General Haig, the gap had not been closed, which had existed between the German 1st and 2nd armies ever since the Battle of the Marne, but the race was lost, owing to a failure of the High Command to appreciate the situation. On the 13th the divisions made a rather cautious and leisurely advance, and in the GHQ orders, there was no hint whatever of the importance of time. By the evening of the 13th September, the situation had completely changed. German reinforcements were known to have arrived, and serious resistance was to be expected on the 14th. Yet the GHQ orders merely repeated the formula that the army will continue the pursuit. There was no plan, no objective, no arrangements for cooperation, and the divisions blundered into battle. With their failure, the flux crystallized and deadlock ensued. A still greater opportunity was thrown away by the French to the eastward. For, on reaching the Aisne, Conneau's cavalry corps and a group of reserve divisions were opposite a 10-mile gap in the German front. After crossing the river, the cavalry rode on 13 miles northwards to Soissons, but then, seeing the danger of being cut off, the order was given to retire to the bridges. This inglorious sense of precaution forfeited an opening such as cavalry would never again enjoy on the western front. For, at Soissons, Conneau's cavalry corps was 15 miles north of the thrown-back flank of the German 2nd Army and 40 miles behind the line of the 3rd Army. It had only to move eastwards across the enemy lines of communication to cause at least alarm and confusion. The question has often been posed whether the trench stalemate would have come to pass if France had possessed a Napoleon. Although the unappreciated defensive power of modern weapons and the unwieldy masses of 1914 weighted the scales against the mobility and decisiveness of warfare, the Gallieni interlude raises a doubt. For not only did Gallieni afford the one instance of Napoleonic coup d'etat witnessed on the Western Front in 1914-18, but his intuition, his boldness of maneuver, and his swift decision were so vivid a contrast to that of the other leaders, French, British, and German, as to suggest that it was possible to snatch a decision by maneuver from the jaws of trench warfare, before the artisan swallowed the artist. The hypothesis is strengthened by the fact that Gallieni's influence was exercised under the most shackling conditions. The command of a fortress was governed by rules and limitations which ordained a strictly defensive role, even gave the governor power to refuse assistance to the field armies, and discouraged him from any wider horizon than that of his immediate responsibility for the defense of the fortress. It was the irony of fortune that the commander-in-chief in the field should have led the way to universal siege warfare. That the commander of a fortress should have conceived and launched the most decisive maneuver of the war. Yet war is a game where the joker counts, and when Joffre withheld the trump, Gallieni played the joker. As he remarked later, half humorously, half bitterly, there has not been a battle of the Marne. Joffre's instructions ordained a retreat on the Seine and the evacuation of Verdun and of Nancy. Sarrail did not obey. He saved Verdun. Castelnau held on to the Grand Caron. He saved Nancy. I have taken the offensive. As for asserting now that it is the commander-in-chief who had gone back far to the rear while I advanced who conducted, foresaw, and arranged it all, it is hard to believe. The truest phrase of all was his first: there has not been a battle of the Marne. Nor had there been a battle of Sedan in 1870. The following